Okay, I'm going to do this as an extension of the lecture that we had 2 weeks ago. Some of you may have the notes on the real distinction between essence and existence. And what I'm going to try to do is to tidy up some of the things we were dealing with there and proceed to the new notes that I hope some of you have for this week. And we're going to try to make a more systematic progress through some of this material than we did before. I'm going to start, as one does in system, by presuming what we have already covered to some extent, and then go from there. And as far as how far we're going tonight, as I told you before, I'm not going to try to pick a certain amount of time. We'll just work our way through the material, and if we have more material for a subsequent lecture, fine. We'll just stop at a certain time point. I'm going to start with a presumption of the real distinction between essence and existence, which we were talking about in that previous lecture, not the last one, but the one before. Just very quickly reprise some of the thoughts that pertain to the notion of essence. Essence, remember, is that which limits, specifies, determines, gives form to any being, and accounts for how the thing behaves. If you're looking at the essence of a thing or the substance from the standpoint of its behavior, that's where we get the term nature from. So nature is substance from the point of view of activity. And we discern the essential natures of things by discerning those activities that are proper to it and not merely accidental. But the main point we're trying to make with respect to essence as opposed to existence, essence would include what we call the specific essence. that would be that which is common to all members of the same species. For example, in the case of man, it would be the definition of man as a rational animal. We also, though, when we talk about essence, we're talking about what may be termed individual essence. That is what refers to all of the accidental qualities which specify and determine a given thing at a given point in time. In other words, it's all the limiting qualifications that restrict the way that a thing is and the way that it acts. At any given point in time, as we know in our own case, as human beings, we are limited to being human, but we're also limited to being this human with these particular qualities at this point in time. Each one of us is sitting or standing in a different place in this room. Each one of us has a different posture. Each one of us has different thoughts, more or less. Even though you may hear the same words, each one of you is hearing something a little bit different from me as I speak, because your understanding is specific to yourself. And in that respect, your existence is completely limited, determined in an almost unlimited number of ways at any given moment in time. You are limited also with respect to not having the qualities which you will have even a millisecond from now, much less tomorrow or a year from now. That is the focus of the Prima Via, the first way of St. Thomas Aquinas, where he is pointing out that things that are in motion must receive their action, their perfection from something else, because they don't yet have those activities or perfections already contained within their being. So when we talk about essence here, we're talking about all the limiting, restricting structures that determine the way that existence is possessed at this time by this individual being. But the problem is, of course, there's an almost infinite myriad of beings, all different, all specified and limited in different ways, all possessing existence. And that's why existence as an act is different than essence. If, as St. Thomas says, to be were to be a horse, then everything that would be a horse. But that, of course, is not the case. Things come in different ways, and the ways that they come are determined by their essences. So essence is really distinct from existence. I also gave you an argument in that previous class showing that if you have multitudes of essences or multitudes of beings, that there has to be something that makes them different. One is really different than another, and that which makes them different is what we call essence. But since the essence specifies and determines the way that a thing exists, nothing's going to have anything in its existence except that which the essence permits. If the essence is really different than existence, we get into a very interesting situation, and that's what we're going to examine beginning at this point tonight. Essence, we take as our starting point number one, essence is really distinct from existence in all finite beings. We say finite because, of course, finite, finis, means a limit. Finite beings are beings in which they have an essence that delimits their existence and, you might say, prevents them from manifesting all possible qualities of existence. As a matter of fact, when you think about it, most every being doesn't have much of an essence because we're just one little tiny being out of the nearly infinite myriad of beings that are actual or possible. So in a sense, we're very tiny essences. But all beings share existence. Existence is manifested in nearly infinite ways by all the finite beings that exist, and all the ones that could exist, or will exist in the future, or have existed in the past. If you're talking about existence as a real perfection, and St. Thomas always reminds us that existence is the act of all acts. It is the perfection of every perfection. It's the only game in town. As Immanuel Kant points out, 100 imaginary pfennigs or pennies is not 1 cent more than 100 real pennies. Or 100 real pennies is not 1 cent more than 100 imaginary pennies. I've got it backwards. Existence isn't simply another quality. Existence is what makes all qualities real. Existence is what makes all essences real. Existence is what makes everything real. But the problem is that there are an infinite myriad of ways in which existence can be manifested. So while all things have essence, which determines how much, you might say, of existence they manifest, they only have a small part of existence that they're manifesting. And even at that, their essence is distinct from existence. So we have the curious problem of, could you have a being whose essence is existence? If it were, then every possible quality of existence would have to be found in it. For the same reason that you can't have a triangle that's lacking a side or lacking an angle. If a thing were to exist by its very essence, if its essence determined it to exist, then its essence would have to contain existence, and it would therefore have to possess every possible quality of existence. And of course, no finite being possesses every possible quality of existence because they're finite by reason of the fact that there's some quality missing. And point of fact, there isn't just some quality missing. In my case, in your case, most qualities are missing. And of course, for a worm or a slug, there's even more qualities missing. So when we talk about a being whose essence would include every possible aspect of existence, we are talking about an infinite being as opposed to a finite being. But for our purposes, what we must notice to begin with is that in finite beings, essence is distinct from existence. Distinct means other than. Other than. Essence is not existence in a finite being. Existence is not essence. Existence is participated by that finite being. It is received. Doesn't have to be there because, as you know, in our own case, and most of the things that we can imagine in this world, they're what we call contingent beings. They don't have to be. I didn't have to be. Before the Great Depression, I didn't exist. Hate to admit I was born during the Great Depression. I may not be born existing during the only Great Depression either. We find that out as time goes forward. But just imagine that. At one point in time, you didn't exist. Did it bother you? I mean, you're here now. You don't even think about it, do you? You worry about dying. You worry about what comes after. But you weren't here before. You just didn't exist. Nobody missed you. They surely didn't miss me. So we are contingent beings. We don't have to be. And we may not be in the future. As a matter of fact, because we are composed of essence and existence, we don't have a guaranteed existence. What is composed can unfortunately decompose. So we don't have such a grasp on existence that we guaranteed cannot go out of existence. You might say, well, what about a spiritual soul? Well, that's an interesting little topic in its own right, but I don't want to get into it. not at this point, because you have to presuppose God's existence, and we're working up to that. But the point is that that's the very notion of a contingent being. It doesn't have to be. Existence is something added to it. Existence is what makes it real. And in living things, what we call life is the name that we give to the mode of existence that living things have. So we not only exist, but we say, well, he's alive, as opposed to he's not alive. Because for us, to be alive or dead is the difference between being and non-being. If existence is distinct from essence, point number 2, existence, or esse, which is a little Latin word for to be, St. Thomas uses. He's actually got 3 expressions. Esse, the to be. Actus essendi, which is the act of the being. And offhand, I forget the third. I think it would just be being.
Ends?
Ends, for heaven's sakes. No, actually, ends isn't right. Ends is the whole being. Ends is essence plus existence. It's something in a gerundive form, like ascendi or something. I can't think what it is offhand. But at any rate, existence either comes from a thing's essence or from an extrinsic cause. Very simply put, if you find a quality in a thing, there's only 2 ways it can be there. Either it comes from the very nature of the thing, or it doesn't. If it doesn't come from the nature, it comes from something else. And as far as existence is concerned, the same thing is true. Either a thing accounts for its own existence by its own nature, or it doesn't. If it doesn't, then something else has to account for it. Now, point number 3, finite essences can't account for their own existence. Why not? We go back to that old principle, nihil dat quo non habet. Nothing can give what it doesn't have. If your essence doesn't include existence, how can you give it to yourself? And if you can't give it to yourself and you've got it, then something else has to have given it to you. Otherwise, there'd be no reason for it being in you at all, and there'd be no reason for you not being non-being. Since nothing can give what it does not have, finite essences cannot account for their own existence, since their existence is other than essence. That means every finite being is a caused being, caused in its very existence, caused in its very being. The word being in English is very confusing because, as somebody pointed out, it's ends. The word being can refer to the whole being. We say a horse is a being, a cow is a being, you are a being, I'm a being. But we can also say, well, the cow has being. And there, of course, we mean it has existence. In that case, existence is not the whole being, but rather that by which the essence is. Finite beings are caused beings. Now, caused by what? And as I mentioned in the note, please recall that a cause must be simultaneous with its effect. I went over that with at least some of you. The problem is we have a constantly morphing group that I'm addressing, but I spent, I believe, one whole lecture going over the need for the cause to be simultaneous with the effect. You don't go back in time looking for causes of present effects. If something is presently being affected, it needs to have a cause which is presently affecting it. It's the most common mistake to think that to find a cause you go back in time. We may thank our brother David Hume for having gotten people used to thinking that way, because for him, causality is simply a necessary association of mental impressions, which may either be simultaneous or sequential. He noted that they could be simultaneous, but of course, first of all, for him, they're just mental impressions. They're not real beings anyway. But I don't want to get into his epistemology. But what happened is subsequent science picked up the notion of phenomena from the idea of mental impressions, and they picked up the idea of sequencing causality, so that the idea of causality became one phenomena being followed by another phenomena, and since they are followed in time, everybody got the notion that cause and effect means something happens and then something later on results from it. So that's the most natural thing in the world. We think of somebody lighting a fuse and then dynamite explodes. And we think, well, the cause came before the effect. So it's vitally important to understand a proper concept of causality in metaphysics is not that. The cause must be simultaneous with the effect. What is making the dynamite, let's say, explode is not the fuse. A fuse isn't powerful enough to blow down a building. What's blowing down the building is the actual rapid expansion of the gases in this violently exothermic reaction between the reagents that are in the dynamite. That's why dynamite's heavy. A little fuse won't do anything, but the dynamite will, and it will only continue blowing up things as long as there are reagents to be expanding, so that a gas equaling 22.4, liters for each gram molecular weight of the dynamite, when you explode it, reacting with the oxygen in the atmosphere, you get 22.4 liters of gas almost instantaneously. That's pretty expansive. So if you've got a really heavy stick of dynamite, you're going to cause a very rapid expansion. But the expansion continues only as long as the reagents in the dynamite are reacting. When they quit reacting, the explosion stops. And that's why you only take down the building, not the whole city. It's a limited causality. But it's a causality that continues only as long as the reagents, the agents, are actually acting on each other. That's mutual causality. But in every instance, you see, to take away the cause is to take away its effect. Because looking at it metaphysically, an effect is a being whose sufficient reason for being is not totally within the being. In other words, you got something that doesn't fully explain itself. If it doesn't fully explain itself, something else has to do it. But you can't, if it doesn't explain itself, you can't say, well, something else is explaining it, but now we're going to take away the explanation outside of it, and also it doesn't have an explanation within itself, because that's why it was an effect in the first place. So if you have a being that doesn't have an explanation within itself, and you just took away the explanation that was outside of it, where's your explanation? You got a being without a reason. You contradict reality. So an effect is a being whose sufficient reason for being is not fully within itself. To the extent that it doesn't fully explain itself, something else has to, and has to be doing it right at the same time that the effect is being produced. Now, if the effect is the rapid expansion of gases in an explosion, then the effect will continue to be produced only as long as the agents are producing it. If the effect is the contingent existence of a finite being, that being will continue to be only as long as something is continuing to give it existence. If you take away that extrinsic support of existence, which its own essence doesn't explain, then the thing cannot exist at all. It would cease to be. So when we talk about finite beings, being caused beings, we are not talking about going back in time. We're not talking about searching for some kind of a possible regression of causes through time. We're looking at beings that don't explain their own being right now. They don't have to be. A finite being, a contingent being, is a being that could be or not be. You and I, unfortunately, don't have to be. We may think we have to be, but we don't have to be. So we are, a finite or contingent being is, as it were, indifferent to existence. It needs something to keep it going. It needs something to keep it in existence. That's the point. And not itself. If it could explain its own existence, then its essence would include existence, and you'd have an infinite being. You'd have a being whose very essence is to be. On the other hand, what you actually have is an almost infinite myriad of finite beings that are all receiving some aspect or portion of this marvelous activity we call existence. You have to understand, metaphysically speaking, existence is not just a word, it's an act. It's the act by which things are as opposed to not being at all. It's an act which takes virtual creative power to explain how a thing could be in the face of being nothing. That's why even Stephen Hawking rather recently remarked how interesting it was that things could just be at all as opposed to being nothing. He sees the very insight that ought to make him stop being an atheist, but he doesn't get it. But I can understand why, because most of these contemporary scientists are so conditioned by the scientific materialism that roots back in David Hume that they are satisfied with the explanation of phenomena in terms of prior structures, sequences of events. That's all they're looking for. So all he's doing is figuring, well, what could have been there before the Big Bang? Or what kind of mechanism could account for some kind of a variation between being and non-being, some kind of a wave on the edge of nothingness that somehow accounts for something being. Some kind of a mechanism. But you notice even that's a structure. That's a structure. That is some kind of a nature. Everything has nature. All the basic laws of physics are an expression of nature, and nature is an expression of essence. It's an expression of certain qualities of existence. If natural science reached a point at which it had no structures of existence, there'd be no science. How could you have a formula of nothing? Pure marshmallow fluff. Even marshmallow fluff has a structure. So no matter how far back they go in time trying to explain things, they've always got a structure of some type that their mind is trying to perceive or grasp. And that, of course, is the way the mind naturally works, because we operate in terms of essence and existence. When you encounter something, the first thing that you say is, there's something there. You're affirming that there's existence, and you're also affirming what it is. It's a hippopotamus. And the mind realizes hippopotami don't have to exist. This one doesn't have to exist. We could shoot it. And it wasn't always here anyway. The mind grasped the difference. That was the point of the man and phoenix argument, that we can understand the nature of something and not know whether it is. The fact that the human mind does this automatically on everything tells us something, because if you can't trust the mind to have discerned this difference, how do you trust it for anything else? It doesn't matter what philosopher, skeptic, or anybody you're talking to, they always are using their mind. They can't help it. And if they do not believe that the mind reflects being, what are they talking about? That's the fundamental notion of truth. It's not what I subjectively think, it's what is objectively real. And if the mind, you notice that what does science do? It's constantly penetrating the structures, the essences of the world. And there is an unbridled confidence that the human intellect can penetrate the laws of the universe. Just give us a little more research money. We'll figure it out.
It's a lot more.
There isn't anybody who, go to Congress and say, maybe we shouldn't put up any more money because I don't see any laboratory proof that we're going to find out anything further. You can tell me what we found out in the past, but that doesn't tell me we're going to find out anything in the future. Where do you get this overweening confidence that there is an intelligible structure to be penetrated by the mind, number one, and number two, that the human mind is capable of penetrating that intelligibility? Both those are absolutely presupposed by every congressman. They just don't know it. So they just say, more money. The human mind grasps the universe in terms of this intelligible structure, but we also are aware of the fundamental difference between the structure and the question of whether something is real. And it's the reality that you're touching when you talk about existence. So, finite beings are caused beings. That means every finite being is being caused here and now by something. Every finite being. How many finite beings are there? Okay, we'll stop counting at that point. Every finite being here and now is being caused. Now, you could get into this question of, could you have a regress of causes? Is that possible? And that raises what we call the problem of, so it says if, it should be of infinite regress among true causes, here and now acting, producing effects. As you know, in each of the 5 ways of St. Thomas, that's a presupposed principle that you can't have an infinite regress among causes. There's more than one way to skin a cat here, but I'd just like to take a few minutes to talk about the question of infinite regress, because people often get very confused by it. It does seem, now please understand, when we talk about regress, we're talking about here and now. We're not talking about going back in time. If you talk about going back in time, you can go to infinity. St. Thomas clearly assumes the eternity of the world in the 3rd way. And yet he uses it to prove God's existence. So, if you're talking about going back in time, there's no reason why you couldn't keep going and going and going. After all, if you believe that God does exist, then why couldn't he have been there forever making things? Why would they have to have a beginning? Any kind of sequence, if he really is eternal and he really exists. So it would seem to be possible that you could go back to infinity. Well, just so you see the circle I'm running against, people will say, well, if you go back and back, you come to a first, and that's where God is, so God must exist. So that's why I say, okay, let's assume God does exist. Then why do you say you have to come to a first? Because God would always be there, and he could be sitting there making dominoes every second from all eternity. And maybe having one knock down the next for all eternity. There's no reason you couldn't have an infinite regression that way. That would not get you to God. That's a notoriously bad way of arguing. So when we talk about a regression among causes, caused, causes, moved, movers, We are talking about them acting now at the same moment in time. Enoch Stumpf, in his History of Philosophy, tries to explain St. Thomas on the first way by using the example of dominoes. You know, if you have a series of dominoes falling over, each one knocks over the next. Now, Stumpf is a good philosopher generally, but that's a horrible example. Because as you well know, if you set up a series of dominoes and you knock them down, the first 1,000 are laying down flat while the last 1,000 are still standing. That's not simultaneous causality, that's temporally sequential causality. It's running through the dominoes. Bad example. Doesn't prove the point. When you talk about causality, it has to be simultaneous. This cause presently producing this effect, this secondary effect acting as a cause to produce a third effect, and so forth. If you think of it that way, now, you can argue in two different ways. I've got them listed here. The pro-argument, as long as each cause is caused by a prior cause, and one never runs out of prior causes, an infinite regress appears possible. Why not? If you have, if you talk about a series of causes, let's say we have some final effect being produced. Doesn't matter what it is. It's being produced by some cause. If we're talking about existence, then it's going to have to be a cause of existence. That in itself has interesting aspects. But if you talk about a series of causes, let's say number 1 is caused by number 2 is being caused by number 3 is caused by 4, and so forth. Imagine we have a chain coming down from the ceiling. I don't have a marker right now, but if we, do you have one?
I think I have it. Yes, the class one.
Ah, thank you. Here we go. Let's say we've got a series of a chain that is going up to infinity. And here's the bottom one. We'll mark it number 1, being held by number 2, being held up by number 3, held up by 4, 5, 6, and so forth. Can you go to infinity? In other words, people say, well, there's got to be something up at the top holding the whole chain up, right? And notice, this is simultaneous, because 2 is actually supporting 1. 3 is actually supporting 2, here and now in a chain. You have a weight at the bottom. Every link is active at the same moment, simultaneously. What's to prevent you from going to infinity here? If 2 really holds up 1, and 2 is really being held up by 3, then haven't we explained the position of 1 and 2? And if 3 is really being held up by 4, then we've explained the position of 1, 2, 3, and of course 4, which is now being held up by 5. On the assumption, what people do is they surreptitiously presume there's a first one. Because they just say, there's got to be one. There's got to be a first. But if you do assume an infinity of regression, each link has a prior link holding it up, doesn't it? If it goes to infinity, you don't run out of prior links. And if every link is being held up by a prior link, then isn't every link's position explained? Because there's a link above it holding it up. And if you've explained the position of every link in the whole chain, you've explained the position of the entire chain. Therefore, if the chain were infinite, there would need be no ultimate holding point at the top. The key insight here is that every intermediate cause, we call these intermediate ones, intermediate causes or secondary causes, every intermediate cause is explained in its causality by the prior cause. And if you never run out of prior causes, of course, that's where people it blows their mind. What do you mean you don't run out of prior causes? There's got to be a first. No, if you're not going to assume what you're trying to prove here, if you will allow the possibility that it does go to infinity, then the whole thing is explained, because each intermediate is explained by the one before it, and that's explained by the one before it, and that's explained by the one before it. If you never run out of prior causes, then the whole chain is explained, and you've gone to infinity, and you don't need a first cause. Just as you don't need an ultimate top holding this chain up. Okay? That's the pro-argument. That's the argument that would say you don't need a first cause, and therefore you wouldn't need a God. The problem is people don't usually present the argument correctly. You can see now, if you go back in time, you don't have to have a beginning. This says even in the simultaneity of the moment, you don't need a beginning. I'll let you ponder that for a split second. Now, the other side of the argument. Intermediate causes are by their nature deficient. They never actually explain the causality transmitted through them. Hence, an infinite regress would never explain the final effect. What on earth did I just say? What we have said is that the position of the bottom link is explained by the next higher link. And that is explained by the one above it. So 1 is explained by 2, 2 is explained by 3, 3 is explained by 4, and so forth. But you have to watch carefully the term explained. Explained in what sense? Do you mean the position of number 1 is totally explained by number 2? If you did, you wouldn't need a number 3, because there'd be no function for number 3, holding up number 2, holding up number 1. Number 2 is not holding up number 1 all by itself. It's holding up number 1 only because number 3 is holding it up as it holds up number 1. In other words, if you're looking for the explanation of the position of the bottom link in the chain, it is not fully to be found in the link above it, nor is the position of the link above it fully explained by the link above that. But in each case, if you seek the explanation, or what we could call the sufficient reason, for the position of the final bottom link, it is not found in the immediately prior link, nor is it found in the one before it, nor is it found in the one before that. Because in each case, you could take this intermediate link, number 2, and just remove it. All it is a spacer. It's explaining why number 1 is a little bit further down than it would have been if it were immediately connected to number 3. If you're searching for the reason for the position of the bottom link, it is not fully given in number 2. Because number 2 is holding up number 1 only insofar as it's held up by number 3. Nor is it explained in number 3 for the same reason. It is holding up number 2 and number 1 only because it's being held up by number 4. If you can't find the sufficient reason completely explained in number 2, and you can't find it in number 3, and you can't find it in number 4, the problem is that each intermediate is explaining something, but it's not explaining everything. If you go to infinity, what you wind up with is a situation in which all the links explain something about the position of lower links, but nothing ultimately explains why the whole thing is held up at all. In other words, to put it another way, if you're looking for the sufficient reason for the final effect, it is not found in number 2, the immediately preceding intermediate cause, nor is it found in number 3, the one before it, nor is it found in number 4, nor in number 5. And in fact, if you go to infinity, what happens is it never gets explained. Because none of the links, taken individually or collectively, offers the full explanation. Let me put it another way in an example which I've given you before. Amazingly, I actually found this example on the internet. I found it on the internet quoting me. I kid you not. It must have been one of my former students. I gave you this example before, though, some of you. It's like you walk into a movie theater, and there's 6 of you, so you buy 6 tickets, and you go up to the person taking the tickets, and the first person says, the guy behind me's got the tickets, and the second one says, the guy behind me's got the tickets. And finally you get to the 6th person who says, well, here's your 6 tickets, and everybody's happy. But what if we were going up to the person taking the tickets, and the first guy says, the guy behind me's got the tickets, and the next one says, the guy behind me's got it, and we go to infinity that way? Does the ticket taker ever get any tickets? What you've got is an overstuffed theater that is bankrupt. You've got infinite patrons and no patronage. Intermediate causes are ontological welfare cases. Intermediate causes are causes that are always saying, well, I'm here, I love you, I'm acting as a cause, but you know, I don't really have anything ultimately to do with this. It's something behind me that's doing it.
Like spokesman.
Like spokesman, all right. But the intermediate causes really are causing. In the case of the chain, they're really supporting the ones beneath them. They really are. But the problem is, they're not doing it all by themselves. What you see with an intermediate cause, just imagine, let's say we were, let me give you an example. Let's say we're doing surgery, and we have a hand that is holding a scalpel, which is making an incision. And the hand, of course, is moved by an arm. I'm not going to keep going here because you say, well, the surgeon's doing it. Okay. But you see, the scalpel and the hand and the arm are intermediate causes. They're all really causing something. But the problem is, with the notion of an intermediate cause, why do we have a scalpel there? Why don't we do surgery with just a hand? I've seen some young ladies I thought could do it. But we do it. We need the scalpel because we have to be able to convert blunt force into cutting force. So the scalpel is a very real intermediate cause because it contributes something to the final effect that would not be there were it not in the chain. But the point is, scalpels don't do surgery by themselves unless you back into them. Scalpels have to be held. They have to be moved to do surgery. They convert blunt force to cutting force, and with respect to that, they are not intermediate causes, but first causes. They're a first cause because that's what they contribute of their very own nature to the final effect. But point is, they're not called intermediate causes in virtue of what they contribute of their nature. They're called intermediate in virtue of what they don't contribute, namely the motion that is passing through them. Why do we do surgery? Why does a surgeon need a hand? I mean, it's much easier to do surgery with a hand than with a stump. So we have to have the hand because the hand holds the scalpel. With respect to the hand as an intermediate cause, it is actually a first cause with reference to holding. But we don't call it an intermediate cause because what it contributes by its nature as being a holding device, we call it intermediate because of what it doesn't explain, namely the motion that's moving through it. Now, I'm not going to keep going here because you would say, well, we got to the surgeon and that's a first cause. But the point is that when you look at intermediate causes, there are two aspects to their causality. There is something that they're contributing to the causal chain. If it's motion, it might be twisting it this way or that way, speeding it up, slowing it down, making it go up, making it go down. Each intermediate is contributing something to that causal chain of its own nature. But the point is, we don't call it intermediate because of what it contributes. We call it intermediate because of what it doesn't contribute. We call it intermediate because of what it's getting from something else. That's why I say their intermediate causes are ontological welfare cases. They're getting their activity in respect to the causation that they're producing. Some aspect of that activity is coming from something other than them. You may look, another way to look at it is, look for the thread of causality that's running through this series of causes. It's not fully explained by the scalpel, it's not fully explained by the hand, it's not fully explained by the arm. Every intermediate, again with this chain hanging from the infinite ceiling, every intermediate is explaining something, but there is a line of causation running through it, through all the intermediates, whereby they are called intermediates because they don't explain the causation that is going through them. They're passing something along, they're doing something to it, but they're not originating it. And because they're not originating it, it's not in their nature. What comes from your nature, you originate in a certain basic sense. That's why you can say whatever you find in a thing is either comes from its nature or from outside of it. If it comes from its nature, okay, we'll say it explains it. An intermediate cause contributes something to what it's producing. But we don't call it intermediate because of what it originates. We call it intermediate because of what it does not originate. And if you have an infinite series of these non-originating causes, that's like looking for a sufficient reason running through all the intermediates. You don't find it in the first intermediate, you don't find it in the second, you don't find it in the third. If you go to infinity, you never find it. You wind up with a final effect without a sufficient reason. All simultaneously acting, all contributing something. You're looking for a thread of causation running through the whole thing, and they all transmit the thread, but nothing originates it, nothing explains it. And that's the problem. That's why St. Thomas in the Prima Via says whenever you have a series of causes and effects, that the intermediate cause is always ultimately caused by the first cause. He goes immediately to the first cause. He doesn't run through some kind of an argument about no infinite regress. He doesn't even mention it. He just says the final effect is never explained except in terms of the first cause. Because intermediate causes as a class are deficient. They're ontological welfare cases. They explain something, but they don't explain precisely what constitutes them as intermediate causes. Whether there be one or potentially infinite multitude of intermediate causes, they're all intermediate. That's why something like a cue stick doesn't play pool. You know, you could play the same game with a cue stick. Let's say you got a billiard ball here and you're moving it with a cue stick. Something's got to move it. Could you put another cue stick behind it to move it? Possibly. Could you put one behind that to move it? Yes. We could go to infinity here, but notice what happens. These intermediate cue sticks, they're all functioning as one. They're just like one big cue stick. And cue sticks don't play pool. You need somebody to move the cue stick. Every series of intermediate causes you can look at is the same way. The problem is when you say that the intermediate explains its effect, it's a charlatan because it doesn't fully explain it. It partially explains it. And the part it doesn't explain is the problem. Because if you go to infinity, you never get a sufficient reason for the causality that's running through and linking all of them together. If you come to a first cause, that's different. But as long as you're running through intermediate causes per se, this doesn't explain anything. Because they're all pointing to the guy behind him. The guy behind me's got the tickets. There aren't any tickets. There isn't any first cause. There's no originating causality. There's nothing whose nature is creating and originating the thread of causation running through every intermediate cause. Those intermediate causes are just a bunch of frauds in themselves. They're doing something with what they've got, but they wouldn't be doing anything if there wasn't a first cause giving it to them. And how many of them there are, it doesn't matter. It's like all your indigent neighbors passing money from one to another. Somebody's got to originate it, or there isn't any money. So that's why the pro-argument that says as long as each cause is caused by a prior cause, and you never run out of prior causes, it sounds very powerful, but you're just playing with words. Because you're saying, notice, it says as long as each cause is caused by a prior cause. What do you mean caused? The intermediate cause is not caused by the prior cause completely. You're talking about it like it's a complete cause. It isn't. The prior intermediate cause doesn't fully explain its effect. It is not fully explained in the prior cause, nor the one before that, nor the one before that, nor the one before that. And if you go to infinity, what you're saying is there is no ultimate explanation because they're all of that nature. And that's why you could treat them all like one big intermediate cause. And an intermediate cause needs something before it. It needs a first cause. So whether you have one intermediate or an unlimited number of intermediates, if it were possible, they are all acting like one intermediate. And an intermediate cause doesn't explain anything. It has to have something moving it. That's because it's intermediate. Any questions before we proceed a little further here? Let's.
Everything we're talking about now, is it applied to efficient cause, or is there a different analysis for the other forms?
It works for all causes.
Okay.
Efficient, formal, final, material, any cause, because a cause is simply an extrinsic sufficient reason for a given effect. So you look for an effect in whatever order it's in, and then you need to have a cause that will explain that type of effect. Point number 6, and this will be the last one we do tonight. A first cause, of applying it to beings of which essence and existence are composite, a first cause is going to be a being in which essence is identical to existence. There must exist such a being, because otherwise all beings are finite, composed of essence and existence, and dependent. Dependent on what? It doesn't matter whether you're looking at the whole universe or part of the universe or all possible beings. If they are beings composed of essence and existence, they need a cause, and a being composed of essence and existence is not going to do the job. Whether you have one or some kind of a series or however you concatenate them or subordinate them, it doesn't do any good. You've got to come to a first cause, uncaused, in which essence and existence are one, a being whose essence is existence, which means, therefore, no aspect of existence, no perfection of being is lacking in it. Therefore, it is an infinite being. And I make reference in the notes here to Exodus 3:14, where Moses asks the burning bush, God in the burning bush, who should I tell the people of Israel has sent me to them? And of course, the burning bush says, tell them that he who is sending you to them. Notice, you might wonder about the I am who am, which is in the previous lines of the text. Ego sum qui sum, I am who am. You might say, well, does that just mean I am who I am? Even the the late version of the Catechism. Cardinal Ratzinger put it in as I am who I am. But that's not an adequate translation, because 2 lines later he says, tell them he who is. He's telling him his name. I mean, just to say, tell them I am who I am. Popeye could say that. I am who I am is like saying it's none of their business. No. This is an exposition of the divine essence. This is actually giving an insight that was not brought out clearly until St. Thomas Aquinas came along and said, he's telling us who he really is, pure existence. And that, of course, is why the Jews picked up stones to throw at Jesus when he said, before Abraham was, I am. To a metaphysician, this is, skyrockets going off on the 4th of July. God is pure existence. This cause, pure existence, is responsible for the existence of all finite beings, which themselves are composed of really distinct essence and existence, and the existence in these finite beings is an extrinsically caused act of existence. This first cause, to use the nominal definition, is what all men call God. And we'll take that as the point of departure for the next lecture.
This recording is produced and distributed by Olteen Library Services, all rights reserved. For more, go to www.aquinasphilosophy.com.